about that?
It's what Jonathan Lethem calls the gulp, which is, that moment in time between when the book doesn't really belong to you anymore, but it doesn't really belong to anyone else yet either. It's sort of like, it's hard to describe. It's almost like waiting for Christmas morning, except you're Santa Claus, and you don't know if anyone wants the presents you're going to give them.
Never thought of it that way.
I don't know. Like if Santa Claus was a traveling salesman.
Yeah.
That'd be what it would. Yeah, that's pretty much what it's like. Yeah. If Santa Claus were a traveling salesman and waiting on Christmas Day.
Exactly. I all of a sudden have empathy for him I've never had for 68 years. I just always assumed he knew how happy he was making everybody. Well, you're on the book tour. You're flying to one of the numerous places you're going to be flying to in a couple of weeks, and somebody sits down and they find out you're an author and that you have a new book, and they say, "Oh, what's your new book about?" What do you tell them there in the aisle seat of your Southwest flight?
Well, I would usually probably stumble and fumble around and totally drop it somehow, probably. But the new book is simply what it says on the box. It's just a way to stay creative in good times and bad times.
I'm going to break in here to share some audio trouble we had. You're going to hear some static, and when I picked up that we were having trouble, we started the interview over basically at a certain point. But what he says in the next 36 seconds, I really want you to hear, and I want to promise you that annoying static in the background will only last for a brief period of time. Then we're going to pick up where we resumed recording, and for some reason there was no static the rest of the time.
It feels like the world keeps getting crazier, and creative work never gets any easier. And so I wanted to write a book about that kind of, took on those two things at the same time. And I think the main line of the book is that it probably won't ever get easier. Life is crazy and art is hard, but there are ways to cope with it, and there are ways to kind of recover your spirit, particularly in times of chaotic times.
Congratulations, you've made it through the difficult listening part of the interview. There is one other part that I had to cut because the static just got too bad, in which Austin says that this third book in his series of books is, he said, it's a book that I wanted to read. It's a book that I needed myself. He's talking about Keeping On, which is the book that's going to be published on April 2nd. And then he talks about the first two books. He said the other books were written for other people. We'll resume with where he describes those first two books, which were titled Steal Like an Artist and Show Your Work.
Steal Like an Artist was a book written for a kind of younger, dumber version of me. It was a book for artists and writers and creative people who were kind of just first getting started in their career. And then Show Your Work was the second book in that series. And Show Your Work was a book about self-promotion for people who hate the idea of self-promotion, basically. So Show Your Work was a book about once you kind of discover your thing and what you do, how do you get it out into the world so other people care about it. And Keep Going is the third in the trilogy, and it's simply about how do you be in this kind of work for the long haul? How do you establish a creative life and keep it going indefinitely for as long as you have, basically.
When you say this is the third in the trilogy, have you decided for sure that there won't be another book like this, same size, same look, general same topic, that there's another creative mountain you're going to be climbing in another 2 or 3 years?
Well, nothing's set in stone. I feel like Keep Going is the perfect ending for a trilogy, but Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade was a pretty good ending too. Hopefully I don't do a Crystal Skull, but I always keep it open. But for right now, it feels like a box set. It feels like the books talk to each other in a really good way. And I would, when you kind of. I would love to, I'd love to do something else. I would love to do another format. I would love to do another, something that I would love to do anything different, but then I also know that these books work, and it feels, I feel like it's rare for an author to not only feel like they've discovered their voice and a style of writing that suits what they're trying to say perfectly, but to also find a format for a book that seems to perfectly capture your kind of mode of thinking and writing and illustrating. I think is very, I understand now how rare that is, and so I try to be grateful for that. When I first started out, if you had told me that my books were going to be shelved in self-help, I would never believe you. And I also, when I first got started, I had no idea there was such a thing as like an illustrated gift book. I just didn't know that those genres sort of existed in publishing. And the really fun thing for me about doing this kind of book that exists, that there's actually a precedent for, that I didn't know, when I did Steal Like an Artist, that there was a precedent for, is it allows me to kind of be as weird as I want to be in a mainstream format. And that is the great gift that these books have given to me. And so it will be hard when I do, the next book, it will be hard to abandon that format because it fits me.
I saw one new thing. I thought there's some cartoon characters. It looks like one's a cowboy and one's a cow, but they both look like they're skulls, and they have some edgy communication between them. Is that the first time you've used those two characters in something you've published?
Yeah, those characters, I don't have names for them. They started appearing in my journals a couple of years ago, and they became like, I very rarely write fiction, but I've read novelists talk before about how the characters speak because they want to speak. The novelists get visited by characters, and I always thought it sounded really hokey and kind of like, quasi, I don't know. It seemed funky to me. But these characters just kind of appeared in my journals, and I would let them say things that I didn't feel comfortable saying in my journals. And then when I was working on the book, they just were able to say things that I didn't really want to say myself. And so they became like little mascots for me. So I think there's only like 3 or 4 of those comics in the book. But they make random appearances, and I always think it's fun in books to put little, if not Easter eggs, to have little things that mean something to you that may or may not mean something to the reader. But it was interesting because as I was putting the book together, I noticed that there's a section where my son Jules, he drew a bunch of skeletons, and I also put those in the book, and so they kind of echo each other in this kind of funny way. And now that I think about it, there's also robots that my son Owen did, and there's a robot that I did. So skeletons, robots, you can kind of tell that this is almost like I don't think of it as an apocalyptic self-help book, but it's America in 2019. Robots and skeletons are on the brain.
Yeah, you may be on the verge of creating an entirely new genre. The bookstores will have to have an apocalyptic self-help section.
I could see it happening. I could see anything happening now.
With the publication coming April 2nd. Oh, yeah. If someone pre-orders Keeping On before midnight Eastern Time on April Fool's Day, what do they get in addition to the book?
We have this very cool print that is a reproduction of one of the Blackout Poems in the book. So I do these things called Blackout Poems, and And for your listeners, if they've never seen them, it sort of looks like if the CIA did haiku. It's a newspaper article, and I black out everything but a few words, and they kind of make like funny phrases or sayings. And the one that starts the book is called Overheard on the Titanic, and it has the words, I mean, yes, we're sinking, but the music is exceptional. and so that kind of starts the book, and that's a print you can actually get, and it's 8x10. It's really nicely done, and you get one of those for free, actually, if you pre-order, and the instructions for that are on my website, austinkleon.com.
Yeah, it looks pretty simple. You buy it wherever you buy it. You get an order number, you enter it in, and then you send your address. So it's pretty low friction way of getting this when you buy the book.
Yeah, keep your receipt and fill out the form on the site, and they'll send you a print. It's great.
Cool.
And some people have already gotten their prints, and it's really fun to see those out in the world.
You have a pretty daunting book tour coming up starting April 2nd, going all the way to May 28th in Vancouver, 27 stops by my count. Do you have any strategy for staying fresh and sane over that amount of time talking about your book?
Yeah, there's different levels of staying alive on tour. There's the physical, where you're just trying to I try to avoid booze, and I try to eat right. I usually try to eat vegetarian on the road, actually, because I just find that that's less chance of getting something bad, and it just kind of keeps you a little cleaner. Mm-hmm. But then there's the mental part of it, and for that, I try to just read on the plane a lot. I find that reading always kind of restores me mentally and spiritually, I guess. And the third big problem of book tour for me is that it gets so tiring talking about yourself every night and something that you've done. And so one of the things I like to do on tour is just try to kind of point outwards a little bit on tour, and I always try at my book readings to like recommend another book that I love. I'll pull something. I try to shop the store if it's at a store, bookstore, and I think we have a weird mix of like indie bookstores and libraries, and a couple of other weird venues on this tour, which is kind of fun. But I always just try to point outwards, because I think the best kind of remedy for getting over your fatigue of talking about yourself is to talk about other people and to kind of shine the light outwards. So I'm going to try on this tour. I'm going to try to keep up my daily blogging habit and my, weekly newsletter habit. And we'll see how that goes. It's a lot though. Tour is tough, and it's especially tough being away from my family for about 2 months. But it is amazing to get out and meet readers face to face. Christopher Hitchens had this great line, and he said, putting a book out into the world, you basically meet all the people that you should have talked to before you wrote the book. They come, they email you, and they come to your book talks, and they tell you what you got right, they tell you what you got wrong. And he said, inevitably, having a book out in the world is like a free education that goes on for a lifetime. And I really feel that way. It's hard for me to start another book before the last one is out in the world, because I'm so influenced by, what my audience thinks after the last one and what they ask me and how we interact and stuff. So book tour for me is also a research mission. I want to hear what's on people's minds, and I want to know what they're thinking and worrying about and need help with, and I want to hear what they can give to me, like what they're into and stuff like that. So it's always a journey, book tour. And not everyone gets to go on one. I have a great publisher, Workman, that still bankrolls book tours for me. So I try to get the most out of them that I can.
Yeah. I was glad to see you got a couple of stops here in Colorado in Boulder and Tattered Cover, which is the best bookstore around. And I think I might be here, so I might get a chance to come say hi at those events.
Yeah, so we're at the Boulder bookstore in Boulder, and then we're at Tattered Cover, which is just I love that store. I mean, both those stores are great, but yeah, to have two great bookstores, like 50 miles within each other, or an hour. It's a great thing.
Well, I thought I'd just dip in a couple of samples of things in the book that would be fun to talk about that show up in the 10 chapters. You start out emphasizing the importance of today and mentioning Groundhog Day, one of my favorite movies. Any idea how many times you've seen Groundhog Day?
Oh, so many. I mean, probably not as many as I try to watch it once a year, and I've probably been doing that for like the past 10 years. So I've probably seen it, I don't know, a dozen times or maybe more. And it's an interesting movie because so many religions have claimed that movie for their own. Like, that was the great story that Harold Ramis, the director, the late great Harold Ramis, probably known best to my generation as Egon in Ghostbusters. But Harold Ramis, and to the generation before us, it's like, it just depends on what generation you're in. Those guys are so interesting, particularly Bill Murray, because he's lasted so long. But Harold Ramis said, he heard from rabbis, he heard from priests, he heard from Buddhist monks, and they all sort of claimed Groundhog Day for their own religion, that Groundhog Day was really the perfect kind of expression of the message of their religion. And for me, though, it really feels just like it feels for everyone else that it has such a relevance for creative work, because I really think that creative work is something that no matter where you're at in your career, like what plateau you've reached, or your greatest achievements, or whether you've just bombed terribly, the question "what next" is always there. No matter what you do, that question always hovers above you, and every day when you go to your desk, it's like a blank page. Sometimes literally, like if you're a writer, and sometimes figuratively. But I thought Groundhog Day was a great place to start with this book, because it's kind of an old-fashioned feeling, but that is the line borrowed from AA, which is like, just take one day at a time. And I think the creative people that I know who have been able to sustain long careers, they have some sort of daily practice that they return to over and over. They have some sort of practice, a verb, something that they do every day, and then their days add up into something bigger.
Yeah, it's such a movie about transformation. I mean, the idea that he gets to practice each small moment of a day over and over and over, and each time be a little kinder, be a little more skillful, that kind of circularity of what he's learning. Does that fit into your sense of creativity as a circular process for you, where you're having a chance to try the same creative challenge over and over and getting it a little better each time?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I used to have this old Russian proverb tacked above my desk, and it said, "Repetition is the mother of all learning." Yeah. The other thing I really like about Groundhog Day is that it's really when he starts. I mean, he almost is a guy who. It's really when he takes on these kind of. If you think about the third act, I mean, he just learns to do these things that are intrinsically cool. Like he learns to play the piano, he learns how to ice sculpt. He actually like takes on these creative practices after he's tried to do all this stuff and like game the universe and try to cheat and steal and try to. It's really when he turns within and he discovers reading and playing the piano and ice sculpting, they sort of becomes the kind of person that you'd fall in love with. Yeah. And I think that's the great message for all humans, but also, definitely creative people, is that you have to, kind of become the kind of person that you'd fall in love with, and the way to do that is to simply do these verbs that you want to do, Phil's the guy that does things, that's the thing I really like in that movie. He's a character that does things, which sounds really, it sounds really simple, but it's not.
Well, that's one of your points. I almost wondered if you had that in mind as the title of the book, because you had it as the title of your talk at the Media Lab at MIT, to don't be a noun, be a verb. And
oh, yeah.
That's talk a little bit about the meaning behind that.
So I gave a talk at MIT at Media Lab called "Creative is Not a Noun," and that's one of the points in the book. And I'm very skeptical of people who identify as this kind of vague noun, like a creative. I'm very like, okay, what would a creative do? Because to me, creativity is a tool. You use it to do things. Like, you use it to organize your living room, or you use it to write a novel, or you use it to just, develop a better missile that'll like blow up a whole village in another country. Creativity is this tool that's sort of that you can use for a lot of different things. And the whole idea that you'd be like a creative and your whole job is to just be creative is just this murky, bizarre thing for me. And I think what it leads up to is like a bunch of lifestyle choices. It's like, oh, I'm a creative. I wear Warby Parker glasses and I have a MacBook and I, co-work at this, place in town or what, whatever it is. And I always feel like I'm very skeptical of job titles, and I'm very skeptical of nouns, because to me, making art, writing, designing, all of those things they're verbs and they're processes, and humans are processes too. Humans are verbs. They're kind of evolving things constantly. And so the idea that you would call yourself a creative to me just never stuck. So I wanted to say the opposite, which is, creative is not a noun. It's more like a verb. It's something that you do, and it's something that it's a way of operating, basically. And so to me, that was just like a huge moment in my life when I realized that like I didn't have to be some pre-chosen noun, that what I had to do was to do these verbs that I love, do these things that I love, and eventually they would talk to each other and it would become this kind of career, and it might not have an easy noun to go with it.
What was the noun that you were chasing before the insight? Writer, artist? What were you trying to fill in while you were still thinking noun?
I always just wanted to be a writer. I mean, that was the first thing I ever wanted to be, and that's kind of how I feel about myself now. I mean, I've dropped the word artist, actually, from a lot of my, when I talk about myself now, I rarely call myself an artist, because I really just think of myself as a writer who draws. And that's actually something I stole from Saul Steinberg, the cartoonist. A writer who draws seems to describe what it is that I do best, because I fundamentally think of myself as someone who thinks like a writer, who basically operates like a writer, who's trained like a writer, but just has these auxiliary things. And they're not even auxiliary because they're kind of central, but where visual thinking and drawing is like a huge part of the process. And of course, speaking and the web has always played a big part in my work too. When I was very young, I was interested in now you would call them polymaths, which is a word I detest. But Renaissance men sounds kind of gendered, so I don't really know. I guess polymath is, I just sounds so hoity-toity to me. I'm just a person who's interested in a lot of different things, and I didn't want to be limited. And I knew that I knew that it was always a particular challenge for people who wanted to do kind of multifaceted careers, but it just always seemed worth it to me to keep those passions in my life, you know.
You talk about hobbies in the book, that there's the things you do, and if you're lucky, you can make a living doing them. And then the value of things that you do just for yourself, just because they're hobbies. What are your hobbies now that are kind of in that private space that you're not leaning on them for a living?
You know, this is the thing. If you turn your hobbies into a career, you got to find other hobbies, you know, because hobbies are really the thing that, in my opinion, a hobby is a thing that fills your time and that gives you, it only gives. It doesn't really take. It kind of refuels you. For me, it'd be music. I mean, playing the piano. Every time I play Bach on the piano, I just feel like someone's scrubbed my brain with a Brillo pad, basically. And I find it, I find playing the piano and playing music to be one of the great. I truly believe that music is the best art form, and I think it's universal, and it's my favorite art form, and I think it always will be. And I feel blessed that I never tried to turn it into my career. As much as I admire musicians, and I have so many friends who are musicians, I do love the fact that music is simply about love for me. It has nothing to do with anything professional. So that's my big hobby. I would like to, I'd like to take up cooking. My wife is a terrific cook, and so I don't do a lot of cooking, but I find cooking to be a really interesting creative activity that I've wanted to get into for a while, and to give my wife a break from. So that's something I've always wanted to pick up. I love playing cards, but my generation isn't really into playing cards anymore. So I need to get a card game going in Austin.
Like poker?
Well, I grew up playing like gin rummy or euchre or something. I grew up in the Midwest, so I grew up playing euchre, which is only your Midwestern listeners will probably know. But anything really that is just an excuse for people to sit around a table and look at each other. That's such a rare. That's the thing I really love about playing cards, is that you, especially a 4-hand game, is when in this modern day and age do people sit around a table and look at each other? It's like eating or playing cards or maybe playing a board game or something.
Yeah, we've got a couple of friends that live in Casper. For some reason, I get the idea of how do you play Dominos, and now every time they come, we play Dominos. And
that sounds
it's just
great.
Hilarious,
I love the idea of having a set of friends that every time they come over, you do something.
Yeah.
There's some kind of oh yeah, they come over and we play Dominos, or we do a deck of, we play euchre or whatever. That's just, I just feel like I truly think that part of the problem for people right now is they've just lost hobbies are just on their way out. And it's Orwell actually wrote really beautifully about hobbies. George Orwell wrote about the British penchant for hobbies, and he wrote during the war, he felt that hobbies, because they were individual activities, his big thing about Britain was that it was a culture essentially of individuals, and that people liked things like gardening, and Orwell wrote about how he felt like hobbies were actually a defense against totalitarianism because they were such an individual activity. He felt like Britain's spirit of individualism always kept them sort of it was a an inoculation against totalitarianism. And when I read that, I thought, oh my gosh, that really really resonates with me right now, because the idea that a hobby, something that you would do for yourself, that you would keep in your life just to kind of enrich and fortify you, could also be a thing that kind of inoculates you against hate and this kind of mass frenzy that goes on around you that makes you more of an individual. And, gardening comes up a lot in this book. The last chapter actually is called Plant Your Garden. And again, I'm not a gardener, but my wife is, and I got really, really interested in gardening as a metaphor for creative work because it's very much the opposite of like something like carpentry or sculpting where you have this thing and you chisel it into something. Gardening is more about like creating the environment in which a thing can kind of grow on its own. And there's actually been really good Alison Gopnik put out a parenting book that was called like The Carpenter versus the Gardener. Or that's the metaphor she used. And she used it to talk about like different parenting styles. And I just think for creative work, it's interesting how many great kind of minds that I look up to think in terms of gardening for what they do. They're trying to create the environments in which things can kind of happen on their own. Prince has a great song called Roadhouse Garden, and he's talking about his studio, and he calls it, "This is the garden where ideas grow." And that's how he thought of his studio. And the band Kraftwerk said the same thing. They said that their studio was like an electronic garden where they went and they kind of like grew sounds. And I just got really interested in that. And I think that, I don't know, gardening seems like a great, and it's a solitary activity, it's like something you do with your hands. You're out in the air. And it just seems like the opposite of everything that's going on right now. And so I wanted to write about that.
Well, and the other thing out in the air, the place the demons don't like is walking. And did you go for a walk, a 3-mile walk with your wife and your sons today?
I did. I got back from it right before lunch.
What did you notice on the walk? What's an example of what you can see by doing that every day?
Well, sometimes I don't notice anything. Sometimes it's more of an inward journey, and that's something I really like about the walk. My 4-year-old today, he was reading the stop signs, so that was kind of fun. STOP, stop. And there's something about looking at the world through children's eyes that you just, for one thing, they're lower to the ground, so they notice all the things that you don't really see. So they'll notice like little landscaping signs, or they'll notice things on the sidewalk, squirrels, stuff like that. Today, but today, what did we notice? The stop sign. The 4-year-old is what knows. But the thing I really like about walking is I like that sometimes you run into things and the outside world is the thing that you notice. And then sometimes it's the inner world. Yeah. It's all your anxieties and your fears and demons, And today, it was funny because we started this conversation. We were talking about the Gulp, the part in time when the book's done and it's not out in the world yet. That was a big conversation topic for the walk today with my wife and I. We were talking about what an anxious time this is for everyone and in our family, even because, Dad's going to be gone for a really long time. And he's going to come back, every 4 or 5 days, but he's going to be gone and he's on this big adventure and things are going to be different here. And, it's just like a time of great anxiety. So it's actually, I love going on tour in the spring because it feels like things are kind of lightening up, and it's nice to go on tour in the spring because everywhere is kind of beautiful, in April and May. So it's a good thing. But, I think the walking, so many of our family problems get sorted out on those walks that we do every morning. It's invaluable to me. It's the thing that, we spent some time up north this winter, and that was the thing that really killed me was, trying to get out for a walk in the snow. It's just kind of brutal. That walk is essential.
It strikes me that we go to a place up in Maine in the summers, and one summer my wife and I, we've been married 43 years. I'll jump in here again with a correction. We've been married 34 years. It'll be 35 on May 6th. And I am sensitive to the tendency I have sometimes to transpose numbers and just get numbers wrong, in light of John Hickenlooper's confession frequently in the early days of his campaign that he can't recognize faces. He has some kind of a condition. He's also dyslexic. And, I get really mad at myself. As soon as I said that, I thought, oh, I just said I was married 43 years. He must think I'm 96 years old or something. And can't go back and fix it, but I'll fix it here for the record. We'll return now to what I was talking about, the walks that Darlene and I have up at Ocean Park. Just decided to walk a mile down to this pier and back each morning. So 2-mile walk, low tide.
Awesome.
I remember feeling, how come I feel differently toward this person, the most important person in my life, when we're walking together somewhere, and the things we can say to each other and how we say it, than if we're at the kitchen table having breakfast or in any other setting. Is it the motion? Is it the being outside? And it just seems to reboot a relationship. And I can imagine if you're doing it as you're doing it like a practice, it really starts changing things.
It changes things, and if you don't get to do it, you feel it really hard. Like if you don't get out for your walk. I've always felt that. You've been married for a really long time, and I haven't been married for as long, but I've been married for 12 years. And one of the things that I've noticed is when you're walking together, you're kind of shoulder to shoulder in a sense, like you're facing the same thing, like you're
right.
Pointed in the same direction. And I really think there's something about being pointed in the same direction. If you're sitting, like next time you go to a diner, I really love sitting next to my wife. There's something about sitting across from her that it's like a showdown. We're like facing each other, and it's just a different vibe. I always noticed that every time we had a meal together where we sat shoulder to shoulder, it felt more like a conspiracy, like we were conspiring together, that we were sort of in on something together versus when we faced each other. So I do think that personally there's something about kind of being shoulder to shoulder and moving through the world and facing the same thing for some reason that I think is really powerful. I think that's part of it. But I also think it's just like you're on this odyssey together, this mini journey, and you feel like a team. Even like a dog, sometimes I feel like a dog sled team when I'm pushing the kids around. I mean, it's like we're a whole crew. It's like a caravan, and it just kind of unites you.
You've got, looks like more than 60,000 subscribers to the email newsletter, which I get. There's something I think it's a similar thing that you're talking about when you're at the bookstores. You're always pointing out to things which interest you, and it's not like, you got a book coming out and stuff like that. But that's a very alive way that you connect with people who are interested in your work. The books, of course, are also major. Every 3 years you have a book. And then the blog, daily blog. Or if you had to choose which of those 3 children of yours that you could only have that as a way to connect with other people, or maybe just compare them, where do you get the most information about your work on those 3 platforms, or what are the other pluses and minuses of communicating those 3 ways?
Well, I have a very bits and pieces form over time into something bigger kind of process. So there's actually parts that people don't see that I occasionally show, maybe on Instagram or on Twitter or something. But basically I carry around this little pocket notebook all day. And just like all other writers, I make notes to myself all day long about whatever. And then in the morning, I have a diary that I go to, and this is just a plain old-fashioned diary that I sit down and do like 3 to 5 pages in every day. And then every day I try to put something on the blog now. I've been doing that for about 2 years. That's how the blog started, and it's come back around to that. When I sit down to the blog every day, I sort of take whatever has come up through the notebook or the diary and kind of try to come up with something that I think would face outward and mean something to someone else. Although sometimes I just do something that I want to share. And then the blog, I will point to from the newsletter, of course, but then I'll also point to other stuff. And then those blog posts over time become talks. And then the talks are usually what become a book. You know, usually when I have like a talk that's really good, if it like lends itself to a book, we'll do a book. So everything's so integrated that I don't really know, what.
Sure.
But I don't know that I could choose. Although I will say that my blog has, from the very first, from 2005. So I've been blogging for like 14 years. That blog has been the heart of everything I've ever done. And so I think that as far as value, I would probably go with the blog. But these days, I find my diary to be the most valuable writing I do, because I think that now that I've kind of become a public person and I have an audience, I find these kind of old-fashioned modes of expression, like a diary, to be hugely valuable. The only other thing I wanted to say about the process is this is a very old process. This is actually exactly what Henry David Thoreau would do, and he's been a big influence on me in the past couple of years. I mean, Thoreau would take these epic walks, around Concord and the surrounding environment, and he'd scribble notes, in the garden, and he would scribble notes to himself, and then he would go back and write for several hours in his journal about, the things he saw and the things he experienced. And then he would give lectures, and he would turn the diary entries into lectures, and then he'd turn the lectures into books. So it's actually a very old model that I just, and that's kind of what David Sedaris does too, in a sense. And it just works for me. I've stopped kind of thinking top down. Books kind of arrive for me in bits and pieces. And that just seems to be, I have to trust the process, as they say. I try not to get too, I'm trying now not to get too anxious in between books, and to understand that if I'm writing a lot, if I'm sharing a lot, that good things will come out of it.
Well, I think they clearly have in this book that is going to be making its way to everybody. I have been speaking with Austin Kleon, author of Keep Going, 10 Ways to Stay Creative in Good Times and Bad. It's available for pre-order with delivery on April 2nd. I'd say thanks for writing this book, Austin, and for talking about it with us today.